Right, what we're going to be looking at today is in line with AC2.3 Marxism from a sociological perspective, looking at the Marxist theory of crime. So we've got to kind of talk through the basis of Marxism, and I'm just going to put in place a very brief overview of the theory, and then we're going to talk about specifically how it will relate to crime. So what I like to do first is I like to draw out my thinking in kind of a flow diagram when I think about Marxism. Some of you may be familiar already with the Marxist theory. If you do sociology, you'll know quite a lot about it. Maybe if you do politics. But Marxism is a sociological theory. It's a theory that's going to look and try and explain how the structure of society works and why people behave in certain ways. And it begins with Karl Marx, who's a name that you might be familiar with. Now, Marx is writing in and around the 19th century, so he's in the 1800s, okay? And what Marx is going to say is broadly that society can be subdivided into two groups, two social classes. The classes he calls the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. Now, you've got to remember what life will be like in the 19th century. There's going to be a lot of factory work. There's going to be the Industrial Revolution just taking hold in the UK, and big cities like Birmingham, London, Manchester having an influx of people who would have traditionally lived in rural areas coming in, seeking the economic growth that comes with this Industrial Revolution. So you've got the bourgeoisie and you've got the proletariat. Now, broadly, you can break those down into the kind of owner, the worker, and of course, the rich and the poor. So Marx only sees those kind of two groups existing, or for the purposes of this, you will only need to really recognise those two groups. Now, I draw this kind of little square inside a big square to represent the Marxist way of thinking, because from Marxist perspective, you've got many of the proletariat and very few of the bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie metaphorically sit in the centre. They're the ones in positions of power, who the kind of world revolves around. And then the proletariat, the main body, the poorer people, the workers. There's lots and lots of them. And the key thing for Marx is that they are all the same. I haven't drawn out a traditional triangle hierarchy and just put a little bit of bourgeoisie at the top there and the rest of the proletariat here. I've just said the proletariat are all the same, meaning there's a lack of social mobility, lack of ability to move up the social strata. So you have these two groups. And what Marx would say is that these two groups are in conflict. These two groups are in conflict principally over money. Okay, so the idea of money and wealth. So in the Industrial Revolution, from Marx's perspective, he sees the rise of these big businesses and these big corporations, and he sees that there is a conflict between these two groups over money, and that money will probably come in the form of wages. Now, Marx does not like the system that is in place. He is very anti-capitalist. And you live in a capitalist society now. There's Karl Marx, looking sad because of this imbalance between wages. He is anti-capitalist, and what he thinks is going on is exploitation. And he thinks it's the exploitation of the bourgeoisie over the proletariat in the form of the wages that they get for the work that they do. And like in any kind of factory environment, what you get is you get the ones in charge, the ones in power. They earn the most, they pay themselves the most, they pay the workers very, very little. They own the factories, they own the materials, they own the money to purchase the materials, these bourgeoisie people. They own the means of production, whereas the worker only has the power to sell his own labour, sell his time in the factory, putting a chair leg on another chair leg on another chair leg in an endless kind of cycle. And Marx is not very happy with this current social structure. He doesn't like it. What he wants is change. And he wants a fairer system that he calls communism. And that's the ideal in terms of what he wants to get to, that would make Marx And you're only going to get that change, according to Marx, through a kind of revolution and a violent uprising where we overthrow the bourgeoisie and everybody then in a communist society becomes equal. The diagram changes, and in a communist society you just get one circle, which is a classless society. So broadly speaking, that's Marx's perspective, okay, in a nutshell. Now, when we think about it in relation to crime, we then need to think about how this system of exploitation, how this system of wage imbalance and monetary difference between two competitive groups leads to criminality. And the first thing is a writer called Chambliss, who we're going to talk about in two sections today, would say capitalism, the system that Marx doesn't like, is criminogenic. And that means in of itself, by its very nature, it will cause crime to be created. So what does he mean by this? How will capitalism be criminogenic for my poor worker, my poor member of the proletariat? Well, Chambliss would say that what happens when you live in a capitalist society is that you kind of take on board the values of capitalism. And what will the owners of the factories be? Well, according to Marx, the owners of the factories, the capitalist class, the bourgeoisie, will be greedy. They'll want the money for themselves, hence why they pay themselves more. They'll be individualistic. They won't care about their workers and their fellow man if they're in trouble. They'll fire them, sack them if they're injured, and bring somebody else in. They'll be in competition to be the business that's making the most money and get other companies out of business. And finally, they will be promoting consumerism, the buying of the materials which the factories run by the bourgeoisie are making. So Chambliss would say that capitalism, by instilling those values, makes crime almost inevitable. Because if you are making everybody greedy, individualistic, selfish and competitive, then people will take from each other in a kind of dog-eat-dog world. So crime is inevitable, especially when there's groups in society without a lot compared to others. He finds that this is the case when he conducts a study in Seattle. The Seattle studies, in this he finds that the bourgeoisie are the main criminals. They're the criminal kind of type. They're in charge of institutions, like the mafia bosses, and they run the racketeering, they run the prostitution, they run the illegal gambling syndicates in and around Seattle. And what they are able to do is buy their way out, bribe their way out of criminality in terms of a prosecution and in terms of an arrest. Well, why? Well, because capitalism makes you criminogenic. So if you're a police officer who is greedy and individualistic, you'll take a bribe to turn a blind eye to the bourgeoisie, and you'll more likely then target the proletariat and arrest them and criminalise the working class, which is potentially a reason why we see the working class scoring very high in terms of our crime statistics and an over-representation there. This ties nicely in to Gordon, and Gordon's idea is selective law enforcement. I'll call it SLE there for short, which basically means that because the bourgeoisie is so powerful, they are using the police almost like a tool, and the police will then go and position themselves in working class areas and target blue collar crime, such as street robbery and violence and theft, rather than targeting bourgeoisie, white collar, middle class crime like fraud and embezzlement and money laundering. So the police will police differently in relation to what class you might be from. And this is Marxist theory on criminality from a sociological perspective. Now, what are the problems with Marxism? Well, a significant problem is his solution to crime, communism, has kind of been roughly instilled in different parts of the world to not great effect. High degrees of criminality still exist in places that call themselves communist, like the Soviet Union or China and places like that. So this idea of communism being the answer to everything that Marx says is probably not quite accurate. And also, one's got to really consider the ideas behind this when it comes to things like selective law enforcement and the dangers that might come with ignoring working class blue collar crime. Yes, there might be, according to Gordon, crimes that exist like fraud and embezzlement, big money crimes, white collar crimes that are going unchecked. But does that mean that what we are targeting is the violent crime, the crime which has got a significant impact on the victim and the daily lives of people? So that is another weakness of the Marxist theory, that it's kind of saying all the serious crime that we should target is from the bourgeoisie, from the white collar criminals, but actually maybe blue collar crime and violent crime is more impactful and more negative to society in general.